Morning, everyone. Wow. The impossible task of trying to summarize 4.5 years in 45 minutes, but we're going to try. So thank you so much for coming. I'm going to talk about my efforts to link socio-political transformations to environmental change in the Republic of Palau. First, I'm going to talk a little bit about Palau for those of you who've not been to Palau before, and then dive into my first chapter on hybridized governance. And that covers modern governance starting in the 1990s. Then I'm going to talk about coral records that overlap that same time period, and then finish by talking about Palau's social response to that environmental change through the creation of a Palau Watershed Alliance. So first, the Republic of Palau is located in the Western Pacific. It's made up of 300 islands, 12 of which are inhabited, for a landmass of 460 kilometers squared, about the size of San Jose. There's 17,000 people living in Palau, 68% are Palauan, and it's the third least populated sovereign nation in the world, with a population density of about 40 people per kilometer squared. Now, when people think about Palau, they mostly think of this: beautiful corals for as far as the eye can see. And yes, that's very true. Palau's southern coasts and rock islands are lined with beautiful coral reefs. But those aren't the corals I'm going to talk about today. Those aren't the corals that can tell us the story of Palau's environmental past. Instead, I'm going to talk about these corals, the corals that line coastal habitats and that are in the wake of sediment plumes like this. Land development like road construction in Palau drives some of this sediment out into important water resources, and we know that increased sediment delivery has detrimental effects on coastal habitats. These impacts are well understood, including reduced coral cover, reduced fish stocks. But where questions remain is how might governance be improved to address these impacts and to adapt to future change. This is particularly important for small island developing states facing the threat of climate change, as well as mitigating their local stressors. So this presents the idea of adaptive governance, which is an approach to adjust management strategies in response to outcomes and changing conditions in a socio-ecological system. And a socio-ecological system is a framework to think about humans interacting with the environment, driving outcomes, and those outcomes drive future interactions. And here you can see is an example of a watershed socio-ecological system. You have resource users, fishers, and farmers interacting with the governance system and developing strategies to limit watershed development, limit impacts on reefs, and through timely and effective adaptive management, you can sustain limited impacts. However, if you have a breakdown in the governance system for a variety of reasons, you can have extensive watershed development and impacts, extensive impacts to coral reefs, and lagged and ineffective adaptive management can exacerbate those impacts. So this is where my dissertation sits in a framework. We're looking at, I'm very interested in the governance systems here and the social networks and how they drive governance processes, and then how the sediment and development and impacts drive sediment delivery. So Palau offers a small-scale setting, a small-scale model to look at the links of environmental outcomes and to look at its adaptive responsive to environmental change. So when I started thinking about what might explain some of the environmental change, what in Palau's past might explain some of the environmental change we see today, I took a deep dive into Palau's political history. Now, I'm not going to go through all of this for the sake of time, but just a few things to point out. First, their customary system started in 1300 BCE, and this is really important and continued to be important throughout its history, and customary leaders are important cultural leaders in Palau. Both the German and the Japanese occupation started to splinter some very important community-based institutions, including clan-based ownership. But my dissertation starts here, in 1994, when Palau was able to achieve independence from the United States and implement a hybridized federalism. It went from a customary rule where the Klobox, or the Council of Chiefs, would sit in a bai and to make rule by consensus, to an American-style hybridized federalism. So my dissertation has three main components. First, I'm looking at drivers of change, particularly social political transformations. And I ask questions about how watershed institutions evolve through these transformations. And I attempt to answer this through a historical analysis. These drivers of change led to environmental outcomes, particularly increased sediment delivery. And I'm asking questions about how land use change affects sediment delivery in different coastal systems, and try to answer that through geochemical analysis of coral reefs. This environmental outcomes led to a social response in Palau, and that was the creation of the Palau Watershed Alliance. And I look at questions about what conditions do government institutions respond to environmental outcomes. And I do that through a policy network of the Palau Watershed Alliance. But first, I can't go any further without thanking the people of Palau. As Rob talked about, I just returned from my 13th trip. I've stayed there, if you stitch all those times together, about 24 months. I was asking a lot of really sensitive questions in my interviews. It took almost a year and a half to gain access to some of the important people who could provide me with some really key insights. So I'd like to thank the people of Palau, both the people on this slide and the people not able to fit on this slide. And I really appreciate the trust and respect for me to be able to tell their story. Okay, so let's dive into Palau's contemporary governance, and that's through its hybridized federalism. And I think this picture really exemplifies the national level government. Here we have the executive branch on the left and the traditional bai that the Klobok or the Council of Chiefs would meet and make decisions. The national government has an executive branch, has a judicial branch, and a bicameral legislative branch, or a two-body legislative branch. And the Klobok, or the High Chiefs of all 16 states, sits on a Council of Chiefs and provides advice to the president. But it's down at the state level, where the inclusion of the customary leaders into the state arrangements are very different. So that's where my first chapter dives in. First, Palau, the size of San Jose, was divided into 16 separate states, each of them with a separate executive branch and legislative branch. Each state developed its own unique constitutional framework through constitutional conventions, and so no two states are alike. To put it into perspective, some of these states just have about 100 people. So for this study, I'm looking at the 10 states of Babeldaw. And that's because this is where the main watersheds of Palau exist, and there's also many states overlap within one watershed boundary. The question I'm going to share with you and the answers that I had from the first chapter concern the idea of state-level institutional arrangements and how it relates to patterns of conflict or cooperation between these customary and constitutional leaders, and how these arrangements relate to watershed governance actions, defined as the establishment of conservation areas, evidence of active management, and participation in the Palau Watershed Alliance. I do this through an explanatory case study using qualitative ethnographic methods. I have 4 data sources, including 22 semi-structured interviews. Now, I'm going to show you a few key findings. And the first is when you lined up these 10 constitutions, you see that there's a gradient of hybridization, meaning a gradient from level 1 to level 5, and how they included the customary leaders into their constitutions. First, in level 1, you have constitutionally dominant actors, meaning no authority had been granted the customary leaders, all the way down to customary dominant, where no democratically elected leaders exist. And in between, you have a variety of different approaches to governance structures. You have a parliamentary system or a presidential system. You have a unicameral system with 2 bodies, or a bicameral, unicameral with 1 body, or bicameral with 2-body legislation body. Okay, so let's talk about a few of these. First is Niramlangui. This is a level 1 constitutionally dominated state. The people elect their governor, and they have 16 legislators to govern about 300 people. The Klobok do have an advisory body, but the Klobok actually was rearranged. The traditional ranking of the clans were rearranged in the state constitution. And this rearranging of the chiefs in the constitution caused a lot of conflict between the state and customary and constitutional leaders, which persists today. On the other end of that gradient is level 5. And one example of that is Natpong, where they're customary dominant, at least until 2006, until the people of Natpong sued the state for not having a democratically elected leader. And in 2006, the Palau Supreme Court sided with the people of Natpong, so they transitioned from a level 5 to a level 1. And that transition alone caused a lot of conflict and resulted in Natpong being the last state of all 16 to establish a conservation area. Melekeok is an example of a state in the middle, and they're at level 4, customary majority. This is where the governor is elected by parliamentary style, and the high chief actually shares heads of state with the governor. The legislators are elected, but there are also customary chiefs that sit on that legislative body. This is an example of a state that had the first conservation area of all the states and established in 1997, and continues to be a leader for conservation efforts in Palau. Okay, so now we've laid these all out along this gradient. What does that mean for its functionality as a state? And what my what my interviews revealed are that there are three levels of conflicts that exist in constitutionally dominated states, and they affect watershed governance actions. First, I talked a lot about this one with my examples, the state constitutional and customary actors. Another example of the conflicts is that watershed scale management is hampered by unilateral actions. And this is an example of the across state governments, and this has impacts particularly for Nirramadu Bay watershed, where the action of one governor dismantled a tri-state effort for conservation. And this gets us back to this governance system where I talked about in the socio-ecological system, where we have conflicts between these important entities that's really having impact on governance actions. Okay, so I've talked about Palau's modern governance. Now let's see what the corals can tell us about environmental change during its most recent history. And I seek to answer the question, what patterns of sediment delivery are revealed by coral cores? So first, just a little bit of how corals can serve as geochemical timestamps. Corals need calcium from the water column to grow their aragonite skeleton. So at the time of growth, they draw down calcium and incorporate that into their aragonite skeleton. But if at time of growth there's sediment in the water, there are trace elements like barium and manganese that corals mistake for calcium in trace amounts. And so at the same time as drawing down that calcium and creating their coral skeleton, they're also drawing down these trace metals that we can use as proxies for how much sediment was in the water at the time of growth. Okay, so a little bit about my design for this chapter. I collect cores along a distance gradient from river inputs in two watershed systems. Here at the bottom is Nirramadu Bay, and that's that system watershed that has 3 states sharing its boundaries. And then E-IPER Bay, which is all within the same boundary of Near Akil, but it provides 80% of the drinking water to Palau. So both of these watersheds are both ecologically and economically important for Palau. I'm testing three hypotheses in this chapter. The first one is that these ratios, manganese and barium to calcium, will decrease with distance from the rivers. And the other hypothesis is that these ratios will be the same within sites. Okay, so I collected the cores using an underwater pneumatic drill, brought the coral cores back to Stanford and created these slabs, thanks to Dave Mucciarani. And then we developed a chronology of corals. So similar to tree rings, they lay down annual growth bands. And so by identifying these growth bands, we can start to have markers of years along the distance of this slab. Then we use stable isotopes, specifically delta oxygen 18 and delta carbon 13. I'm not going to get into the details behind that, but I'm going to show you a graph of the peaks of delta oxygen 18, which can be seasonality signals. And so we compare the peak of delta oxygen 18 with these growth bands to establish a chronology. So here we see a peak. This is flipped over, but here are the peaks that match with these growth bands. Okay, so now that we have a chronology, we know how old they are, we're going to look at the trace metal ratios during that same time period. So these slabs were ablated using a laser ablation ICP-MS. Ratios of barium to calcium and manganese to calcium were calculated averaging 2 parallel tracks. And then I used Mann-Kendall statistical tests to look at statistically significant upward or downward trends in the coral records. For land use patterns, I established a chronology both by using earth-moving permits and historical records like the annual rainfall from the National Weather Service rain station in the airport in Palau. And this is to test whether these ratios correlate with timing of large storm events and earth-moving activities. Okay, so for the land use patterns, I collected earth-moving permits from Palau's Environmental Quality Protection Board from 1996 to 2016, which were cataloged by location and footprint. And they did not have a database, electronic database, so I pulled 1,085 paper files and analyzed them for size of cleared area, type of construction, duration, and notice of violation of erosion control. And this was really hard for me to gain access to, so I'm really grateful for people allowing me to sit in their boardroom for 2 months to pull all of this stuff. So I'm just going to go over a little bit of the results. First, this is a timeline of major earth-moving events and weather. Here we have year at the bottom. We have some La Nina and El Nino years, major typhoons. Just keep in mind this 1990 typhoon and then these two here at the end. And some major earth-moving events, the airport expansion in Irai, and then almost 10 years of compact road construction. And this was a 53-mile ring road around Palau, which was at the time the largest infrastructure project to be undertaken in Micronesia's history. Okay, so a summary of the earth-moving permit data. On the left y-axis, we have the number of permits per year, and then we have the footage. And as you can see, 2006 obviously had the highest footage. Something to note here that until 2017, all farming activities were exempt. So these permits only include residential or road construction. Something I'd like to point out, when you look at states and their total area, Nyeremlangui, the one here in the middle, had some of the lowest number of permits, but order of magnitude greater total area. And something to flag for you, this 2006 peak was due to a noni, a fruit tree farm, that was permitted in Nyeremlangui in 2006. So just keep that in your mind, because it's going to come back later. Okay, so here are the coral cores. I'm going to show you a few of the results. We had 2 from Irai Bay and 6 from Nyeremadu Bay. So here's the one from Irai Bay. It starts in 1985 to 2015 at the time of sampling. The top is barium to calcium. The bottom is manganese to calcium. These 3 numbers here, this is the Mann-Kendall coefficient and its p-value to show its significance, and then the slope showing the rate of change. And what you can see is that both ratios show an overall statistically significant increase through the length of its record. I want to point out where there are some significant peaks that might be linked to things that we know were happening on land. First, this is the timing of that airport expansion. We know this is one of the wettest years on record for Palau. This is when the compact road was underway. And this is Typhoon Bofa. Okay, let's move over to Nyeremadu Bay. And this is core 5. You can see he's kind of in the channel leading out of the bay. Once again, barium at the top, manganese at the bottom. Interestingly, both ratios are showing a decline in overall in time. But there are still some significant peaks. Here's, yet again, some of the wettest years on Palau's record. The compact road. This is the noni farm. Remember, I told you to keep that in mind. We see that potentially that's what this peak represents. Okay, let's continue going towards the open ocean in Nyeremadu Bay. This is core 6. And we see that these 2 ratios actually increase with time and actually at a higher rate. Once again, we see some markers around the same time as the compact road. We see that noni farm peak again. We see some rainfall peaks. And then what's interesting here is this jump in both of these ratios during a time that 38 acres were cleared right next to this reef for a housing project. Okay, so I only showed you 3 of these, but these are all the cores, and you can see why I didn't show you all of them. We have the year here at the bottom, and the blue box indicates peaks that were significant, statistically significant for barium, and the red boxes are for manganese, statistically significant peaks. So what I want to do is just show you a few earth-moving permits, a few earth-moving activities that we can link to this. First, the airport, and then some weather events. We see that rainfall here. We see that all cores, no matter where they were and no matter what watershed system, we saw every core have a peak at some point during the road construction. Then we see some weather patterns again, and then interesting, these 2 cores had peaks around the same time as that 38-acre housing development, and they never recovered through the rest of the record. Okay, so some key findings from this chapter. First, this is just a summary and to orient you to where some of these land use activities took place. The noni farm was here near the Nirmiskan. This 38-acre housing development, the stream is not on this map, but it leads straight out to where the other coral is. Irai Bay, we see the compact road construction, the airport, and the typhoon. And it's important to note here that the typhoons hit on the eastern side of Palau. And so that's why we think that there might be more of an impact on the Irai Bay side than the Nyeremadu Bay side. Okay, so some key findings. Most cores show an upward trend of increasing trace metals through time. All 6 cores with records before 2003, basically during that time frame of the compact road, showed significant trends, and some even persisted for many years, indicating that the compact road did in fact have impacts on sediment delivery. Next, the trace metal ratios did follow that sediment gradient. We did see higher ratios in cores that were closer to the rivers and decreasing in ratio further away from the rivers. However, we did see some inconsistent patterns between sites. And in future studies, things like water samples and rerunning slabs might help tease out some of the factors that might drive these differences between sites. Also, finally, in the key findings, the increased ratios in 2012 and 13 that I indicated were driven by typhoons. We did not see that in 1990. In 1990, Typhoon Mike was just as fierce and high winds as 2012 and 2013. So we're wondering if that indicates that there's more increased soil exposure now than there was in 1990. Okay, so we've talked about the governance, we've talked about the core records. Now let's talk about Palau's social response to the environmental changes that the records showed us. And I do this through a policy network analysis, and let's just talk a little bit about what that means. So the BWA, the Palau Watershed Alliance, was facilitating a policy network. It was a third-party facilitator of vertical coordination from the national entities down to the communities and back up, and horizontal coordination across communities, across states, and across national entities. And that's within this framework of a watershed policy network. And a policy network is a concept that's rooted in political science and organizational science, describing the network structures embedded within governance systems. And we're able to ask some interesting questions, given Palau's small scale, about the network structures embedded in these governance systems, because we're able to track every single actor that was engaged in this network and be able to connect their ties to potential outcomes. And that's what this study seeks to do. We assess the relationship between network structures and the performance, these governance processes, through 10 years of BWA activities. I seek to answer what shifts occurred in the network structure to support governance processes. Okay, so here's a little bit about my design. So the independent variables were network structures, and I use social network analysis to measure them. My dependent variables were network performance, and that was examined through the NE Water Management and Transition Framework. I'm not going to not have enough time to explain this entire graphic, but suffice it to say that what you can do is you can place these activities that the BWA that were underway in the BWA within these policy and learning cycles, and then ask questions about how they move through these policy cycles and how the network structures can impact those activities. Okay, so let's talk a little bit more about methods. First, I use primary and secondary sources to trace activities and to look at and identify actors, including 45 semi-structured interviews. I measured network structure in 4 ways. First, through network density, and then 3 ways using actor tie distributions. That's degree centrality, betweenness, and closeness. So network density describes the connections of all the actors in the network. Okay, and the idea here behind this is that when you have a high network density, that means everyone's closely related. So there's high levels of trust and more willingness to collaborate and could facilitate joint action. But when you have a less dense network, that might be more an indicator of more inclusive of actors with diverse knowledge and different ways of knowing. And having actors with different ways of knowing may be helpful when you're planning and implementing management solutions. Okay, so we use 2 types of edges for the actor tie distributions. And the reason why we wanted to identify the actor ties is because we're looking for 2 major actors in the network. The first are mobilizers. And these are people that have influence and potentially formal or informal authority. They know a lot of people in the network, right? So they can mobilize resources and use their influence. The second type of actor I wanted to identify are these brokers. These are the people that link subgroups. And subgroups are embedded in these types of networks, especially in natural resources management, where you have a lot of resource users or governance entities that are overlapping. So linking across these networks are really important for participation. Okay, so now you know how we measure network structure. Now for network performance, the NTF activity diagram depicts a network of action situations. And we define action situation as a structured social interaction with specific outcomes. So basically, I took all of the activities of the Palau Watershed Alliance for 10 years and situated them in this idea of action situations. So let me kind of walk you through how the activity diagram works. First, there's a significant event. And for Palau, it was the compact road. That catalyzed action situations. The first was a watershed summit. That led to an outcome, which was the knowledge, including the knowledge of state watershed threats. That action situation led to another action situation, which was developing a state working group to obtain BWA membership. And that interaction led to another outcome, which was legislation, along with other things. So in this way, we can map over the 10-year period how action situations led to outcomes and how those action situations are led to future action situations. So I'm going to show you in my results a really complicated graph. So I'm going to walk you through kind of an example of what it tells you. So this activity diagram, like I told you, is this network of action situations. Here we have the network and the years that that network encapsulates. We have a significant event that led to an action situation, and the three potential outcomes are institutions, which could be like state legislation, knowledge, like learning more about your state watershed plans or threats, and operational outcomes, which could be like physical interventions of mitigating sediment runoff. Okay, so I'm testing three hypotheses in this chapter. The first is that the network density will decrease when action situations progress from joint action to planning. And this is along the lines that I just talked about. Highly dense networks are more likely to have joint action. So they would move from phase one in that policy cycle I showed you, and then into phase two and phase three. When the network density moves from high to low, this is what I predict you will see in the activities of the BWA. Hypothesis number two is about mobilizers. When mobilizers are present in the network, we're going to see more joint actions. We're going to see a lot more of the activities concentrated in phase one. Then for brokers, given that they're linking subgroups and helping to bring people together, I predict when there's more of these brokers in the network, we're going to see more planning and implementation, more phase two and phase three. So is that what we saw? Let's see. So I'm going to just orient you to the sociogram. I'll show you a few of these. And these clusters up here can be considered subgroups. These nodes represent an individual actor, and the bigger the node, the higher the centrality measurement. And remember, the mobilizers are the influencers, and the brokers are linking subgroups. Then I'll show you the really big and complicated activity diagram, but I'll try to keep zoom out and direct you to what I want you to focus on. Okay, first, the network structures through time. Overall, we identified 251 actors and 8 different networks during this 10-year period of time. I'm not going to go through all of these for the sake of time, but just so you kind of understand our approach to structures, I developed network structures for measurements for each one of these and compared it to the activities that were underway during this time period. Okay, so from our results, what can we say about brokers in this network? First, they belong mostly to NGO subgroups. And not only were they connecting subgroups to allow for exchange of ideas, they were directly providing knowledge and human capacity to states for them to develop watershed management plans. I just want to show you an example of some brokers. Here's my network 160 and 214 are actors that are definitely acting as brokers between these two groups and these two groups here. Okay, what can we say about mobilizers in the network? Most of them belong to state government subgroups, and they were present during the time of state commitments. But interestingly, these customary leaders were mobilizers in early networks, and later state constitutional leaders were as network mobilizers later. Meaning, let me show you a sociogram to explain that a little bit. So these are the mobilizers here, the dark green nodes. These are all the high chiefs, the customary leaders of Palau. And then we have a constitutional leader here, 116. And two things happen as these networks progress. First of all, the mobilizers are present in the center of the network at the very beginning. As we move forward, the mobilizers depart from the network and brokers become the centerpiece. The other thing to notice is that when these constitutional leaders are not in the network now, like I say in this bullet point, but as it moves forward and then BWA refocuses back on phase one, most of the mobilizers are now constitutional leaders. Okay, so let's talk about some of the results for network density. At the beginning in Network 2, where the activities were focused on states joining the BWA, making joint actions and commitments, we see a density of 0.18. But when the network transitioned to planning, when they were thinking about, okay, the states have decided they're going to do this conservation area, but where should it be placed? How should we do it? What's the strategy behind that? The density decreased. Then as the network moved from planning and planning Network 3 back to programmatic advances, where they were looking back and assessing current states, the density went up again, insinuating that the network was once again got tighter as they were making these phase one decisions. Okay, so what can we say about network performance? I told you it was a complicated graph. So overall, the 88 activities of the BWA, I consolidated into 22 action situations. That's basically because if you're developing a draft strategic plan, how many meetings do you have to develop that, right? So I lumped the activities that were appropriate under one action situation. Let me just orient you to the key really quickly. So the action situations are brown and orange, and these three are the potential outcomes, and the significant events are the ones that happened at the beginning of this network. Okay? What you can see here is how I divided the networks into separate networks so that I could measure structure and see and assess the performance of the network during that time period. And I don't have time to go through all of this, but just suffice it to say that you can trace these action situations through time and the institutions, and then ask questions about what phases were skipped, what phases weren't even focused on, and what that can say about ways to improve adaptive governance in Palau. Okay, so some key findings. Brokers activated mobilizers at the very beginning. And these initial brokers, remember I pointed 160 and 214 out, they served dual roles in the network. They worked for NGOs like the Nature Conservancy and the Palau Conservation Society, but they also were state legislators. They sat in these policy decision groups and were able to leverage both of those roles to garner the right support. The second thing that was important about these key brokers in the early phases, they had strong ties to these customary leaders, which allowed to get those customary leaders together to garner the support for the BWA. Next, network density was higher during joint action, during those phase 1 processes. We saw the highest network density in network 1, where a lot of transformative learning was happening, where the paradigm shifts were happening. And then we saw the second highest in network 4 when the BWA activities went back to thinking about phase 1. And then what can we say using the MTF that allows us to assess adaptive governance? Well, first, because at the end of this 10-year period of time, 8 states had established state watershed conservation areas, 5 of which continue to be managed today. And they are reviewed every 5 years through the Protected Areas Network. However, infrastructure investments for monitoring and physical interventions lagged behind. So while they had a lot of activities and action situations around planning and strategic goal setting, it really was hard for them to secure funds in order to put into place monitoring infrastructure and assets. And that's why I believe monitoring processes were infrequent in the network. So phase 3, so there were a lot of phase 1 and phase 2 activities, but phase 3 was really lagging behind. And another reason why that might be is I'm looking at a short time window, 10 years, right? So maybe if we looked at this network in 10 more years, we might see a lot more monitoring and infrastructure. And then finally, the mobilizers were mostly at the state level. Either customary or constitutional leaders, they were mostly operating as mobilizers at the state level with very few national leaders engaged. And that might help to explain why during this time period, they tried unsuccessfully to pass 2 different national level policies on land management and minimizing sediment delivery. Okay, so key findings, network density varied through time. Higher number of mobilizers were present during times of joint action, and brokers were present in the network. But like I said earlier, what's very interesting to me is that they also provided knowledge and human capacity. So they were not only bridging networks, but they were facilitating knowledge exchange, and they were knowledge bearers as well. Okay. So in summary, first I talked in chapter 1 about the hybridized federalism. Then I looked at some of this environmental change during this time period. And the big environmental change that sparked public concern over increased sediment was this compact road. This public concern led to the establishment of the BWA. Okay, so for my overall conclusions, first, we saw that the inclusion of customary authorities varied along a gradient of hybridization in Palau, and that these constitutionally or customary dominant states, level 1 or level 5, have conflict that affect governance functionality. And then in my core chapter, findings link the compact road construction and years of heavy rainfall to increase sediment delivery. And this shows that Palau did have a social response to this environmental change. But what's also interesting is that we had different ratios between the 2 watershed systems. And this suggests that there's localized land use events, as well as these years of heavy rainfall that can impact sediment delivery. And then in my BWA chapter, I saw that policy mobilizers prompted an institutional change. And finally, transformative learning only occurred in highly connected networks. That transformative learning is really important, like I said, for paradigm shifts and moving things in a different direction. And that really only happened when everyone was really tightly connected. So let's just talk briefly about some broader implications. So My work on looking at varying degrees of traditional authority affecting watershed governance is a relatively unexplored area of research for Pacific Island settings. There's a lot of conversation about how varying traditional authority affects marine tenure and how modern governance affects fisheries management. But I looked at it from a watershed and a land-to-sea interaction. This study also showed the positive effects of a watershed alliance model in the Republic of Palau, and that this might actually be a model that can help other similar settings deal with some of their degrading watershed systems. But this network study also provided insights on the causal relationships between network structure, who's in the room, who's part of this network, and the governance processes that result from those interactions. And so this provides some considerations for network design to advance watershed governance processes. First, the uptake of a foreign organizational model, a watershed alliance, received broad support due to the fact that they engage with the customary leaders first. Now, the Watershed Alliance was not something Palau had heard about before. It was the Nature Conservancy and Palau Conservation Society employees that brought it to their customary leaders. And these individuals, these key brokers, knew that it was key to gain community support was to first get the customary leaders on board instead of going directly to the constitutional leaders first. And then second and last is a key role of international NGOs in providing knowledge resources, like the TNC and PCS model, may be best delivered by brokers embedded in the network, right? So the TNC, it was better that they were providing this knowledge and this information and these tools to Palauans to then infiltrate the network. Thank you. Ooh, that was quick. Oh, I wanted that the whole time I was talking. Okay, so I'm just going to do a few acknowledgments before Q&A. First, to my committee, you guys, this is truly an interdisciplinary committee. We have geochemical scientists, we have a lawyer, we have someone who does education, a coral ecologist, a physical oceanographer who I've never seen wear a tie before, so I had to use that picture. I did a little, yeah. But I want to thank all of you for, I came into Stanford, like Rob said, really with a strong policy background. And I can see that I grew as a scholar because of all of your help and guidance and patience. So Nicole, we don't know how you do all you do. You're truly an inspiration, and you do it with a smile and with grace. And we thank you for everything that you do to for our community, for E-IPER, and for the students that are fortunate enough to work with you. So thank you. To Bob out there in Hawaii, thank you so much for all your work. He's been working in Palau for 33 years, and so he was key at introducing me to some community folks and really gave me the initial credibility in Palau for people to trust me. To Stephen, I like you in the tie. I remember you were one of the first professors that I didn't know coming here that really asked me in-depth questions about policy, and it gave me a sense of confidence that I actually did know something. So thank you for your continued engagement and for believing in me. To Meg, you've been with me since the very beginning. I remember meeting you at Capitol Hill Oceans Week, and we had lunch, and you wanted to hire me on the spot. But I decided to do a PhD instead. So I thank you for your inspiration to continue doing this work and for the amount of time that you put into editing my dissertation, and I'm a better writer because of it. Thank you. And to Rob, I remember that first moment. I remember you peeking your head around my office door, and you're like, have you ever heard of this program called E-IPER? And that initial conversation about this program changed my life. You told me about E-IPER at a time when I was in a fork in the road. I was either going to be a policy wonk or I was going to go back to science. And this was the only PhD program I applied to, and it was the right one for me. So thank you for introducing me to that. And and I learned so much from you with your work as working with policymakers. Over the 5 years that I spent working with policymakers, I've never seen them mesmerized by someone like he mesmerized policymakers. So I can't thank the E-IPER staff enough. I know that maybe everyone says this about E-IPER, but it's amazing the amount of support we have. And it is really hard to pursue an interdisciplinary PhD, but it's much easier because we have amazing staff. Tons of funders. My E-IPER cohort, Philip is in the room, yay. Tons of collaborators, including Joyce and Kirsten, hopefully she's online too. And then to the labs, Dunbar, Mona Smith, and Bob's lab. And then I have a bunch of people in the room that I want to thank. I'm not going to cry. But this is from our wedding on New Year's Eve. And a few of you are in the room, Jess, Ellie, Maggie, my in-laws, Affinity, and Monkey Boy. Thank you guys for being here. It means a lot. There are a few people in this picture that I want to call out specifically. First, Mallory. She is the only person that I've lived in a 4x4 room with for more than... We spent a lot of time in the villages in Palau, diving every day, hanging out with the local village cats, but she's also become one of my best friends, so thank you for your help. She sent me all these affirmations over the last week telling me I could do this. To my brother Ryan, who I hope is online, he is the only person until hopefully today that has a PhD in our family. We're the first generation to go to college on both sides of our family, so he's always been an inspiration to me. I remember growing up and opening my bedroom door and having to climb over encyclopedias that he was reading to get past him, to take him out to hang out in nature. And I think it's only fitting that today is his birthday. So happy birthday, brother. And then finally, to my love, Stephen. We've only been married for 7 weeks, but you've been my best friend for 2 years. Our ventures are just beginning, and hopefully I can't wait for having weekends so we can spend time together. But he was really an amazing support, and I don't think people tell you how much and how hard getting a PhD is on the people that love you. So he's been my strength and my light. So thank you. Okay. Thanks.
I have to cry too. No, spectacular talk. Thanks for pulling all that together. Now it's the time in the public exam where we take questions from the audience. I think most of you know that after this part, the committee will convene in 252 in this building for a session that's private questions between Staci and her committee. So committee members can ask questions now if they want to, but first I want to open it up to anyone from the floor here.
So you said toward the end that maybe this study in Palau's changes could be implemented someplace else. What other kind of country would be enough like this that these learnings would be helpful?
Yeah, so there's other nations in Micronesia, like the Federated States of Micronesia, other islands in that geography that could really use this type of watershed management where they've gone through similar political transformations. Places like Micronesia or Oceania as well. And obviously local context is important. You can't just apply this model everywhere, and that's what meant that this BWA was really successful, is they had people who were local that could modify it and tease it apart. But this idea of implementing a model that allows people to figure out how to bring communities together, I think can be broadly applied. So Micronesia or Oceania or other places.
Valerie.
Okay, so you have Nirmaldui and Yatpong, level 1, level 5 next to each other. How does that, can you offer either insight or an example about how that affects the management of the Nirmaldui watershed?
Yeah.
That would be so different?
Yeah, well, I mean, there's inter and intra-state conflicts between these two states, right? So inside each state, they're obviously dealing with the conflicts that the state customary and constitutional leaders they're at odds. And then Yatpong's the same way. In fact, they didn't really have a fully elected leader governor until 2017. So those create conflicts within the states and they're the overall authorities of the resources, right? So if there's conflict, there's not really a lot of participation and compliance for resource users, right? So there might be overfishing, there might be bad land use practices. But then at the state level, these states are actually dealing with a boundary issue where they are arguing over where their state boundaries lie, but they also share near Madu Bay. And it's affected, the disagreements between the state governors have led to dismantling of the watershed management plan. The BWA tried really hard, and the core team members, these main brokers, tried really hard to bring those two states together, but they haven't, as of yet, been able to successfully re-implement the watershed management. So I think it has to do with the governance conflict at the state level between the customary and constitutional leaders. And I think if the customary leaders got together between those two states, I think you would see management actions improve.
And
you had suggested that BWA resulted because of damage to corals from sedimentation, but was that the main reason, or was it just noticing that the bay was deteriorating in other ways, or could you?
Yeah, so all of my qualitative interviews, everyone talked about, in all of my interviews, everyone talked about this period of time when the rivers were just super murky, they couldn't see the corals, and I was excited, in a good way, but in a bad way, to see the same thing in my cores, right? So I was actually able to validate the community's concerns through what the corals were telling us.
Just elaborate a little more. Sure. Was the community interested in the corals in terms of their health, or was there some other resource they were cleaning? Fisheries, like the overall ecosystem?
Yeah, all of it. But they're also really worried about their water, right? So Babbledab, they don't have clean water. They're still, I mean, they do have clean water. Let me correct that. There are moments, many times a year, they have to boil their water, right? So they're already struggling to achieve pretty good water quality. And so to see all their water resources completely murky from bad land use practices really concerned them. And so that's why these chiefs came together to be like, wait, this is our job. This is what we used to do. And you constitutional leaders aren't doing your job because there are impacts here. So we need to fix it. And that's why they came together and started the BWA. And they knew if they got together and said, hey, let's do this, they're the high chiefs of Palau, and the customary leaders still drive communities and motivate them. So they knew they were the right messengers.
This is really interesting. Congrats.
Thanks.
I was wondering how easy it is to get a permit to do something. Is there an environmental assessment process, or if you could talk about that?
Yeah, so up until 2017, every EQPB permit was approved, right? And I don't know, and it depends, if you have large construction projects, pretty visible construction projects, if you're putting up a huge hotel, there's a lot more oversight. Whereas residence permits, they didn't really provide a lot of oversight. And the entire agency is made up of 5 people that can go out and check these permits. So I think just the process of applying and all of kind of the bureaucratic tape that goes involved with it hinders people from, potentially being bad actors. But the other thing to think about, these permits, there are probably a lot of illegal activities that this permit database didn't include, right? And they might have gone outside of their permitted area to clear. So this was a good way of kind of capturing overall land use, but there's a lot of things that we can do to improve our idea of average footprint per year.
Could you talk more about the water mix in Palau and how it's viewed as a resource, if it's viewed as a public resource, or if it's specific, like there are wells that are owned by people?
Yeah, so the states own all of the resources on land and up to 12 nautical miles offshore. And so I think that's when the states are actually at, there's a lot of tension within the states that actually impacts their ability to provide enforcement on their conservation areas. And there's a protected areas network. I alluded to that during the BWA, but that's really why BWA kind of took the back seat, because the protected areas network kind of took BWA's position of being a knowledge exchange network. And they are helping the states by providing them funding to manage conservation areas. And so there's a lot of marine conservation areas within that 12 nautical mile zone. Not as many terrestrial protected areas, but since the BWA, they've tried to link these land protected areas with marine protected areas for more of a land to sea protection. So right now the marine area is protected and managed by the states, not individuals.
Yeah, I'm going to take the privilege of asking a question. This one's kind of forward-looking, and I'm curious about your views. I can't help but notice the last several times I've been there, the increased number of foreign ag advisors, like Taiwanese, and they started building I don't know what the word is, a piggery. That's what people said.
Yep.
I don't know if that's the right term, but they built a slaughterhouse, and what's the future of sediment erosion? Is Is it expanding, or do you think they're starting to get it under control through the alliance?
Well, I think the one thing that these Micronesian states, these nations, they're close to each other, so I think they're learning from each other. And Pohnpei is a nation that has had enormous amount of negative impacts from installing a bunch of piggeries, right? So I think Palauans understand the impacts potentially of piggeries from their neighbors, learning lessons from their neighbors. But they're also trying to deal with food security issues in Palau, right? Right now they're a cargo ship-based society. If they miss a cargo ship, I've been there when they've missed 2 and there's not really food on the shelves. So, you know, we have to think about how to balance the development in the way they need it with minimizing environmental change.
Fair enough. Well, listen, if there's no other questions, then we will thank Staci once again